ahead and be turning to the fourth chapter of the book of Galatians, Galatians chapter 4. That'll be where we'll be resuming our study of Galatians here momentarily. Galatians chapter 4. Before we get into Galatians 4, a couple of things we want to look at. This morning we will look at our outlines that we've been looking at over the book. And then we'll get into chapter. Well, I don't have the chapter content slide, but we'll go to chapter content too, and then we'll get into chapter 4. The book of Galatians is about the defense of Paul's apostleship and justification by faith through grace. The reason for the second half, or the reason for the first half, is because that's how they were attacking Paul for that second half, and that is, they were saying Paul is not really an apostle. At least he's not an apostle in the same sense that, say, Peter or John is an apostle. And so because of that, Paul has to defend his apostleship in the first two chapters before beginning in chapter 3 and chapter 4, he defends what he teaches. He defends the gospel message. So William Hendrickson, in his outline of the book, outlined it this way. 1 and 2, the gospel's origination. That is, it is from God and not man. 3 and 4, it's vindication. 5 and 6, it's application. Irving Jensen's is similar, though he does his second section goes through 5:1, and the third section begins at 5:2 and goes to the end of the book. But his three sections are the source of the gospel, the defense of the gospel, the application of the gospel. Now, what about the outline that we're following? This is my outline. It's the apostleship defended 1 and 2, gospel defended 3 and 4, application defined 5 and 6. Now quickly, we'll remind ourselves of the chapter content as it builds upon where we are in chapter 4. So chapter 1, Paul is an apostle of God, not man. He began the book by making that claim in verse 1 of chapter 1. Paul, an apostle, not from man nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. In chapter 2, then, he talks about how he's not an inferior apostle. That is, some of them, it seems, would say, well, Paul's an apostle. But he's not on the same level of apostleship as, say, a Peter or a John. And so Paul defends his apostleship in chapter 2 by pointing out that he was approved by the apostles at Jerusalem. The message he had been preaching, when he came and told them that, in a relaying of what I believe are the events of Acts 15, they agreed, they added nothing to him. That is, they didn't say, well, you're forgetting to teach this, or this is what you're saying is wrong. Showing that the gospel he was teaching was from God. He then proves that he's not inferior by giving a rebuke of an apostle, the rebuke of Peter, at the end of chapter 2, which serves a twofold purpose. The first of those is, it shows he had the authority to rebuke him, so he's not inferior to Peter. Secondly, he rebuked him with the same gospel message that the Judaizers coming into Galatia are calling into question. The same message he talks about in 3 and 4, justification by faith, is not through works of the law, it's not through circumcision. He talks about that in that rebuke to Peter that's recorded at the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 then is that we're justified by faith apart from the law. So we're now ready for chapter 4, which builds off of chapter 3. We're going to go back to chapter 3 and catch some things in a minute. Chapter 4, the contrast of covenants. But before we get it started in chapter 4, let's back up to verse 26 of chapter 3. We were talking about this when our time ran out, but there's an important word that occurs here, particularly in verse 29, that we want to make reference to because it helps us in chapter 4. Backing up to verse 26, he said, "Now you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Now we'll stop there for a second. He says they're all what? Verse 26. Sons of God. They're sons of God through faith because they were baptized into Christ, verse 27. There's no distinction. There's not Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. They're all one in Christ. So, verse 29, and if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and what? Heirs, according to the promise. Now that's important because when we get into chapter 4, he's going to come back to that word heirs again a couple of times. So let's begin in 1 through 7. You're slaves under the law versus you're now sons by faith. So look at verse 4, or 1 through 5. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, does not differ at all from a slave, though he is master of all, but is under guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the Father. Even so, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world, but when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem us, that those who were under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. And so what he says in 1 and 2 is, even though there may be one who's going to be the master of the house, right? The heir. So if you can imagine, the illustration is using as somebody that is heir to something that would seem to be some rather large estate. And so he's heir to this. And if something happens while that heir is still a minor, while they're not old enough to take care of himself, what's the difference between the heir and the servant? Nothing. There's no difference. Are they going to be an heir? Yes. Is all this going to be theirs? Yes. But at this point, they're not mature enough and ready enough to handle that. And so he says, even though he's an heir, he doesn't differ from the slave, though he's the master of all. He's under the guardian and stewards until the time appointed by the Father. Till the time that he's old enough, mature enough, ready enough, that he can take over as the heir. Right? And so at this point, even though he's the future, he's the heir, he's going to be the master of all, he's no different while he's that minor from the slave He's under guardians and he's under stewards. Well, he uses that illustration to say this, verse 3, even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. And so here you've got this picture painted, the master of the house, the heir, he's no different than a slave. Well, he says over here, when we were children, we were under bondage in the elements of the world. Now, there's really two parts here to this. There are two main things. The audience at Galatia is largely Gentile. Now, we're dealing with a lot of issues out of Judaism, but it's still largely Gentile. The issues result from the Judaizing teachers. So again, most of them are Gentiles. So there's two senses. The sense in which when they were, before Christ came and they could be adopted as sons, under whatever they were trying to serve, they were under bondage. But then at the same time, and he's going to point this out more as we go through the chapter, those under the old law were under bondage as well. They weren't truly free. But, verse 4, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Now, let's take a look for a moment at this phrase, the fullness of time. What does it mean, the fullness of time? Well, there are some things as we go back, and we talked about this the other day about Christ fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. He's the end of the law. We alluded to Romans. He's the outcome or the result. That's why the law was the tutor to bring to Christ. The fullness of time comes. What does that mean? Well, a couple of things about the fullness of time. The fullness of time was during the days of the Roman Empire, first and foremost. How do I know that? Well, first of all, when I look at what is said about Christ, he's there. But the Romans had to be in power before the Christ could come, because that's what was prophesied in the Old Testament. Remember Daniel chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar has the dream of the statue with the different parts, and then it's rolled by the stone that sits up as a mountain, and he says, it's in the days of this fourth kingdom. Well, you go back through history, and you can count, as you count those that are in power, and the fourth kingdom is Rome. So the Christ would come in the days of the Romans. The second one is he'd be preceded by a forerunner. Isaiah 40 and verse 3. Christ was preceded by John. So there's a forerunner, fullness of time. When all of these things were in place for what have been prophesied, that's the fullness of time. But why was this such a good time for the fullness of time? Now, why is it Christ didn't come 100 years earlier or 100 years later or 300 years later? Here's a couple of things about this time frame as to why it was such a good time frame and it allowed for the spread of the gospel. First and foremost, you had a universal government in Rome. Rome was over about everybody. Rome's over everybody, and so there was a universal government. It was a period of peace. From about BC 17 to about 68 AD is a time of peace. 68 AD puts us at the end of most of the writings of the New Testament. Depends on what date you take on Revelation and John's writings. But most dates are put pre-70, with the exception of, if you take the late date, John's writings taking place in the 90s. But even at that, outside of John's writings, the rest of them are pretty much dated to have taken place during this time frame of peace. It's during this time frame of peace that we have Paul's preaching journeys, we have the events of Acts recorded. The events of Acts actually closed at about 62 or 63 when Paul makes it to Rome. And even that time in Rome is briefly sort of passed over. Most of the details end by about 60. Number 3, travel was easier because of the universal government. Their road systems and everything. It made travel much easier to be able to go about and teach. 4, there was a universal language. Now, people still had, you still had Jews who would speak Aramaic, Hebrew. You had people that would speak other languages. But pretty much everybody at that time frame knew Greek. They knew the common Greek. And so when it goes to teaching the gospel, most people are speaking one language, and then the dispersion of the Jews made for a ready audience. When Paul goes to most of his cities, the first place he went was to the synagogue. Why are the synagogues? The Jews are pretty much dispersed abroad. And so there was an audience there who were familiar with the Old Testament, though most of them rejected it. But there was ready audiences about. The fullness of time had come. Now here's something to note as well in verse 4. When the fullness of time had come, what did God do? He sent forth his Son. So here's a couple of things to note about this. First of all, he's pre-existent or eternal. God sent forth. Not that he created his Son. His Son is eternal. But he sent him forth. He's there and now he sends him forth. Not only that, it shows Christ to be deity. Remember John 5, where there were those who, when Christ talked about being the Son of God, said he's making himself equal with God? Paul in Philippians would point out how he did not consider equality with God a thing to be used to his own advantage, the NIV says. And the point is, he's the Son of God. He's deity. Not only that, he's born of a woman. Look again at verse 4. When the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman. That's talking about the fact that he was born of a virgin, Isaiah 7, and in verse 14. And then he was born, he was born under the law. Two meanings of that. One, he obliged to obey the law of Moses. The other is he had perfect obedience qualifies him for the work of redemption. He was born when the old law was still in effect. Remember what the Hebrew writer would point out? Where there is a will or a testament, there is of necessity the death of the testator, whoever's will that is. Right? A will takes effect when the person whose will it is passes away. And so the point is, where there's the testament, there's the death of the testator. Christ hadn't died yet. So what law are they under? They're under the old law. And so that's what the law he was under, and the law he had to keep. So, here's what we understand. There was a time in which, when they're under the old law, they were as slaves. Right? Or they were under bondage. But when that fullness of time had come, that is when Christ had come, when God sent forth his Son, who was born of woman, born under the law, which again gives some evidence of Christ, born of woman, specifically born of a virgin, that was done to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And so what's the purpose of him coming? So that they can receive adoption as sons. So now, 6 and 7 is a contrast to 1 through 5. 1 through 5, you were a slave, or you were under bondage under the old law. Or for the Gentiles, you were under bondage before the new law was in effect, whatever they were serving and under. Now verse 6 and 7, look at what he says. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. Now here's the point that he's driving at in this text. Now you are a son. Now you can cry, Abba, Father. Now, when he goes back and he contrasts that, under the old law, what he said was, you were as a slave. But now, you're as a slave or as a minor, but now under the new law, you're a son, and as a son, you are an heir. That's why we tie this back to chapter 3. He said that those that are sons of God and are Abraham's seed are heirs. But how are they heirs? According to the promise, verse 29. And he comes and he ties that in. We'll come back to that idea of according to the promise later on in chapter 4, when we get to the allegory that's used at the end of the chapter. But he's making the point that in order to be an heir, you have to be a son. And under the old law, you were as a minor, you were as a slave. But under the new law, you're as a son. Now it begins in verse 8 and gives them an exhortation to continue in service of Christ. Some of them have gone back to or turned to the old law. Either there were Jews going back or there were Galatians trying to turn to it for the first time. Both occasions were happening. And what he said in 8 through 11 was, but then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those who were by nature are not gods. But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements in which you desire again to be in bondage? You have observed days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain. So what Paul's saying here in this section of verses to them is, when you didn't know God, you served the things that are not God's. And again, we're talking mostly here at Galatia is a largely Gentile audience. And so here were people that engaged in idol worship. And so you're worshiping idols, you're serving things that are not God. But now verse 9, you have known God. Now, before there may have been some who knew about God. But there's a difference in knowing about God and knowing God. And sometimes when somebody says they know, we'll use this illustration. Sometimes when somebody says they know somebody, they don't really mean that they know them as in they have a relationship with them. Right? What they say when they say they know them is they know who they are. Right? I can tell you I know the governor. But you could call him and ask him who I am, and guess what? He doesn't know who I am. When I say I know the governor, I don't mean I know him personally. I'm saying I know who he is, right? That's what he's saying. Before there may have been some. Now, these are largely Gentiles, so a lot of them were still pursuing other things. But there were some who may have known who God is. But they didn't truly know God. In fact, he said to know God is rather to be known by God.
You think about James, right? He said, you believe in God, you do well. Even the devil is believe and tremble. And it's kind of like belief in being a son. So does that passage say that the fact that these demons believe in God, they're sons of God? Absolutely not. We know better. So to connect the dots, like you said, it's more in depth to know someone. And it's that close personal relationship. That's what this context will bring out.
You're right. It is. It's that close relationship. I'll go back to my illustration here in a minute of the governor when we get to the end of this list. But I want you to think about this idea, as Mike mentioned, that it's a close relationship, and look at some of the things that describe this relationship. In verse 5, he says you're adopted as sons. In verse 6, you can cry out, Abba, Father. Abba being Aramaic for father, so you can cry out, Father, Father. He says prior to this, the relationship they're now in, they did not know God. And he equates knowing God to being known by God. Verse 9. So again, I guess.
If I have it right, the use of Abba is a term used to say father with an expectation of an heirship or being an heir of that father. Is that right?
Yeah, it was the term that the Hebrews would have used, which you're right, they would have that sort of expectation, I think, of heir, that was their sort of term of endearment for their father, crying out Abba, showing that close relationship. Not just like, sometimes somebody may use the term father and not mean it in the to their actual father, but not mean it in a sense of a close relationship. It's right. That use of Abba, that heir, shows that closeness of that relationship and that expectation that they have that, they're heir to that promise. They have that same kind of relationship with God as the Jews who would be heirs of their fathers would have with Him. So you're right, it does show that. But verse number 4 on the list, to know God is known by God. I'm going to go back to my illustration. I could tell you I know the governor, and then you call the governor and say, do you know Michael Webb? And he'd say, who's that? Right? He doesn't know me. And then you might come to me and say, you know what? You don't really know the governor. I know who he is, no, but you don't really know him. What if you called him and he said, oh yeah, I know Micah. Then you say, you know what? You know him. How do you know I know him? Because he knows me. And so what Paul's saying here is you don't just know God and that you know who He is, but you're known by God. You're known by God as His children, His heir, the heirs, according to that promise. And so, because of that, you have that close-knit relationship. Now, what he said to them is, after you've known God, or you've been known by God, why do you go back to being in bondage? Why do you desire again to be in bondage? Again, going back to what he said previously, you were in bondage. Either the Jews under the old law or the Gentiles who the old law wasn't for. They were under bondage. Now under the new, your sons and your heirs. Why, when you're a son or an heir, would you go back to being a slave and in bondage? That doesn't make any sense, does it? That's what he's trying to point to. Your sons, your heirs, and now you're trying to be in bondage as a slave. Why would you do that?
That was the problem with the Egyptians. The Israelites, they came out of Egyptian bondage, and they should have been happy, but it wasn't very long till they were longing to be back in Egypt. They forgot about all the oppression stuff they suffered, and God was displeased with them because they even longed to go back. You know, and it's kind of like today, I guess, in a way, we can maybe become new as a Christian, and then we start really counting the cost of it, which we should have counted up front, but we really didn't. And then we see not what man expects of us, but what God expects of us. And then we say, well, if I wouldn't have signed up for this, and they wouldn't expect this out of me or whatever like that. And we don't actually have to go back. Just actually in our hearts to long for that is wrong in and of itself.
You're right. I think about the point Paul made in Romans chapter 6, which again, as we said with Galatians, Galatians is kind of a Romans in miniature. It's a shorter version dealing in these middle 2 chapters with a lot of the same things. And then he ends in the last 2 chapters with an application section, which he did in 12 through 16 of Romans. And in Romans chapter 6, where he talks about continuing in sin, we alluded to that a little bit the other day about him answering questions that could be raised. When he gets to the end of that chapter, or in the middle of the chapter, he talks about you're not under law but under grace, and then can you continue in sin? That seems to be their question again. Another statement he made, and he goes on and says, no, you're slaves to whom you obey. And then he talks about the fact there's no fruit in them. So those things of which you're now ashamed, there's no fruit in. Going back to that life of sin, there's no fruit in that. Why go back? And that's the point he makes. And he's making a similar point here to the Galatians. Why go back to bondage? Now let's look at verse 10. Verse 10, you observe days and months and seasons and years. What specifically is he saying? I don't know the specifics, but this can give us an idea of perhaps what he's meaning. Sabbath for days, perhaps Sabbath days. They're observing a Sabbath, which is no longer, and in fact, they're under the new law. Sabbath day is not the day of rest anymore. Months, a festival of the new moon, perhaps. Let's talk about Leviticus 23, Numbers 28, Psalm 81, Isaiah 66. Seasons, perhaps the Passover, the Pentecost, Tabernacles, things that lasted a little bit of time. And then years, perhaps talking about the sabbatical years of Leviticus 25, or the years of Jubilee, the latter half of Leviticus 25. We don't know the specifics, but it seems as you tie this together that these are likely because what they're doing is they're going to where? The old law. And so these would have been some of those things under the old law.
Paul would have taken advantage of that. We know, like we've already discussed, he would go customarily into the synagogue first. And I believe it was when the book of Acts we studied that there was things that were more of a custom that they done. Well, Paul used that to his advantage because during this transitional period from Judaism to Christianity, he had to use some wisdom there and navigate through that and take advantage of those situations. Hopefully at some point those Jewish people would have came to the realization that these customs, even these certain laws, were no longer binding. But he had to use some wisdom when navigating through that. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to get his foot in the door. Kind of like we talked about circumcision. He had Timothy circumcised so he could get his foot in the door, so to speak. Later on, he didn't do it with Titus. So, all these things, he used wisdom, and the purpose was to bring people to Christ.
You're right. And going back to this list for a moment, as you look at this list, some of these are different than others. But like observing the Sabbath day specifically. If somebody obeys the gospel and says, you know what, I don't feel that I can work on the seventh day of the week, I feel guilty about it because I haven't done it my whole life, then what should they do? Not work. Right? Until they get to the point they realize, you know what, that's no longer an effect, I can do that. And so you're right, Paul's keeping some of those customs. But the problem, with the customs and stuff, as we talked about before, is it's not like when Paul says, you know what, we're going to circumcise so that way it opens the door, versus with Titus, we're not going to circumcise because we're not going to give in. There's a difference if he says, I'm going to observe the Sabbath day because it helps me with my foot in the door, versus I'm going to observe the Sabbath day because the Jews say we have to, and they're trying to bind that. And so, you're right, it would open doors of opportunity. And if the Gentiles said, you know what, we're going to do this so that the Jews feel more comfortable with us, that's one thing, versus the Jews saying, you have to, and the Gentiles doing it. If the Jews are saying you have to, you've got to do it. The Judaizing Christians are saying you have to. The Gentiles need to stand firm and say, no, we don't. I think of the passage that occurred in the Bible reading this week in Exodus where Pharaoh tells Moses, you can leave, but you have to leave behind the livestock. And Moses makes the statement, not a hoof shall be left behind. And his point is, there is no compromise for what we believe. Yes.
I think about where we studied somewhat recently. It said, Paul said, I became all things to all men. That doesn't mean he was like a politician telling everybody what he wanted to hear, but rather he would look at situations. This person had a Jewish background. He would approach them a certain way to teach them while not conflicting with the law, the truth. I mean, the truth of God's word, the new law we live under. But somebody had a Gentile background, he would approach that person different. And we see with the eating of meats offered idols and all these different things. So there again, there's a teaching for us today, the way we approach people. If we know these people and we know what their background is, it can be a great advantage to trying to navigate through teaching the word of God.
You're right, absolutely it can. And Paul, even in like Acts 17, starts on a common ground and builds from there. Lord willing, we'll pick up here at verse 12. We'll touch on the 8 through 11 again briefly, but we'll pick up at verse 12 and go through the end of chapter 4 on Wednesday.